I'm Christopher Thornburg, founding partner of Beacon Economics. Join us today on the show, talk a little bit about the realities of the world around us today and what the economy is really doing. Are you being lied to by both sides of the aisle? I think you'll find out you are.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron, is the founder of FullMontyLeadership.com. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Leadership and Loyalty Tips for Executives, part of the Full Monty interview series. I'm your host, Dov Baron. I'm the founder of Full Monty Leadership, and I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything. Let me ask you, are you committed to up-leveling your leadership? Well, are you prepared for the economic changes before they happen? Or will you just be like most people and you're going to just try and surf the wave, hoping that it's not a tsunami that will drown you and your business? Stay tuned to find out. Remember, you can chat about this episode or any past episodes inside our Facebook groups and our LinkedIn groups. Just look for the Leadership and Loyalty podcast. If you're a new listener, new viewer, thank you for joining us. Strap yourself in. We're about to go full Monty. As always, you can find us around the world, wherever you tune in your podcasts. You can go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you tune into podcasts. And remember, we always need your help in staying relevant. So please go over there, rate, review, and subscribe to the show. You can also catch us on traditional radio stations across the United States, all the way from Las Vegas to Florida to Wisconsin and even in Quantico. You can also catch us on Roku TV, where there's over 100,000 subscribers. And if you're a regular listener, regular viewer, we want to sincerely thank you for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners, with a potential reach of 2.5 to 4 million listeners for every single show. And we're honored to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. Did you know that you can also get us on Google Home, Alexa? Just find out by just saying play Dov Baron podcast. Again, thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. All right, let's strip it down and dive right in. As a leader, whether you're a CEO, someone in the C-suite, a sales leader, an entrepreneur, a leader in any capacity, you know that all economies go through cycles. They go ups and downs. The truth is that business can be destroyed in either. It can be grown in either. For the most, the change in economics is approached with about the same level of discernment as a Vegas crapshoot for most businesses. The changes we face in business today with AI, renewable energies, increasing global workforce, how can we get our head and our hands around the inevitable changes that we're facing? Well, let's find out together, because our guest on this episode is Dr. Christopher Thornburg. He's the founding partner at Beacon Economics. He's also director, adjunct professor of the UC Riverside School of Business Center for Economic Forecasting and Development. So, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me welcome the guy who may be the psychic Sue of economics, Dr. Chris Thornburg. Welcome, Chris.
Pleasure to be here, Doug.
Have you ever been described as the psychic Sue of economics?
Not quite, but I like it. I might have to put it on my business cards.
Yeah, that might be the answer. So before we start, one of the questions I like to ask my guests is one that we live in a very influenced world. So one of the questions I like to ask is, who's been a major influence on your life? Who's somebody that we may not suspect, may not even know, who's had a major influence on you and your leadership, your philosophy, whatever it is? Who might that be?
That's a huge question, to be honest with you. I mean, I was very fortunate when I was at UCLA doing my PhD to work with a genius of an economist who really, in many ways, shaped my view of the world and how I think about the economy. It's funny that I ended up in the forecasting business. I'm not a macroeconomist traditionally, and when I got pulled into this by my dissertation advisor, a man named Ed Lemer. I remember him saying, I said to him, Ed, I'm not a macroeconomist. Why would I do forecasting? He said, well, your head isn't screwed up by all that nonsense. You got your feet on the ground, and that's what's going to make you a good forecaster. And in many ways, that approaching the field, I think, with feet on the ground, not allowing yourself to get blinded by theory, has always been for us an enormous advantage over, I think, many other people in the space. We don't just jump into all these crazy theories about how the world works. We really focus on what I would call just a traditional, what's actually going on kind of philosophy, looking at the real world, not focusing on weird financial stuff. And actually, it's been really paid off well for me over the years. I feel we've been dead on accurate in terms of our forecasts. And I think we're helping people better understand the world around them, which is so important today.
Well, let's go into that for a minute, because I think this is where we have to start. I mean, obviously our listeners, our viewers are leaders in all kinds of ways, but it's one of the things actually when I was talking to somebody about having you on the show, and I was talking to somebody about it who's a very influential leader, and I said to this person, describe what economics is to me. And it's fascinating to me that that's a question that is a nebulous question.
Yeah.
So what would you say is the biggest misunderstanding about what economics is?
It's funny you should say that, because every single economics class I've ever taught, I actually stand in front of my students, and the first thing I ask them is, what is economics about?
Right.
And everybody always will say the traditional stuff. It's about GDP. It's about markets. It's about inflation. It's not. Those are all outcomes. Those are all results. Economics is inherently a social science. We're not in the physics building. We're over in the building with the political scientists and the sociologists and the political scientists. We are a social science. We study people and what people do. Now, that goes almost back to what we talked about, my philosophy of thinking about the macroeconomy, because you start with the reality that the macroeconomy is made up of millions and millions of people just trying to get by. And understanding what those individual people are doing on a day-to-day basis, understanding what drives them, is how you understand the macroeconomy as a collective. Right. So it is really a people business. I study what people do.
I think that's a beautiful explanation. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Because
I think that so often we get caught in theories and ideas, and we forget that behind everything, all those highfalutin ideas you have disappear when humans are gone. Yeah. Right? There's no zebras standing around going, I wonder what they're forecasting for the economy.
Exactly. Right? No, it is, and even, I even think about the fact that when you think about economics, where economics is, the best economics being done today is not being done in economics departments. It's how other parts of, if you will, academia have absorbed, if you will, the almost the philosophy of economics, and they've adapted that into what they do. So, for me, the best political science is done by economists who are thinking about the political world from an economic perspective.
Right.
Same thing in sociology, same thing in policy and urban planning. So you will find that these philosophies, this idea of how we view human behavior, is such a powerful tool that lots of different groups that want to study society will adopt those tools.
So, but I wasn't actually looking to go in this direction, but I love that you've opened this up, because then it just, in many ways, it's kind of like that old symbol of the snake eating its own tail, because one would say, based on what you just said there, which makes good sense, is that economics is people, but the economy determines how the people behave. The people determine how the economy runs. So it's, you know what I'm saying? So, absolutely. I mean, obviously it all disappears if there's no people,
right?
But it also, the circle runs in both directions, right?
Kind of. I mean, again, okay. I think that the idea of when I talk about the economy, Yeah, I use that as a noun, as if it is a thing.
Mm-hmm.
But an economy, again, is the collective actions of all the individuals operating within that place. So it really is it's just a collection of the multitudes, if the case may be. If I'm going to sit around and talk about GDP growth, inherently what I'm talking about is how are the decisions that 340 million Americans today are going to influence the total amount of economic transactions happening within our economy.
Right.
So you gotta be always cautious about describing the economy as a beast unto itself. It really isn't. It is
Right.
it is the collective result of the individual decision making of all these people.
And then we move into the classifications of those people, which is the 1%ers, the 99%, the people living in poverty, the middle class. You know, we can break all those things up,
Right.
and I guess, you know, the idea is to look at it all as a whole. But oftentimes when we do that, we lose the people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I always find that, you know, when I do a lot of speeches about the economy, and very often I talk about the economy in the whole and the positive things I see. And it's funny how sometimes people think that means I've forgotten those who are being left behind.
Right.
And no, I mean, you can describe the collective trend while still acknowledging the fact that there's suffering out there.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I, you know, when I talk about the economy, a lot of my talks today focuses, if you will, on, I think, a lot of the misperceptions of the health of our economy.
Mm-hmm.
But even when I try to correct those misperceptions, at the same time, I always have to go back to the idea that, yeah, look, no matter how good things are, there's people who need help.
Right.
And our job is to appreciate what we do have and to use, if you will, that wealth and prosperity we do have to help those who need a leg up.
Yeah.
But you can't go there if we're delving into this kind of crazy world where our people are constantly telling us just how terrible everything is. And of course, in politics today, it's always the other party's fault.
Of course.
That's
the rule,
kind
isn't
of
it?
rhetoric is so damaging to the ability for us to actually handle the problems around us today.
And I do want to come to
Yeah.
miserableism, as you called it, a little bit later on. But
Yeah.
right now, you know, I mean, looking at the hard facts a little bit, you know, unemployment obviously is at a record low, which which sounds great.
Yeah.
However, one organization estimated, I believe it was in 2015, that 13.5% of Americans, which is 43 million people, live in poverty. Yet other scholars underscore that number is actually not really true because there's so many people living near poverty, and that number is actually almost a third of the US population. So this to me is like this, you know, like, 'cause I'm always, who am I listening to? Because, oh, we've got this record, you know, this record economy, and there's, you know, we've brought unemployment down, and I see families who, you know, need 3 jobs just to keep the family running at the basic level, you know. So can you help us understand that a bit more, Chris? Because I think it's a real battle for people who want to shove it left or shove it right. You know what I mean?
Well, let me start by first taking on the term poverty.
Okay.
Because there is what I would call absolute poverty, and then there's relative poverty.
Right.
And part of the issue we have is we focus so much on relative poverty that we forget that the statistics we have do a fairly poor job of actually measuring absolute poverty. Now, what I mean by that, take the poverty statistics, depending on how you slice it or dice it,
Right.
14, 15, 16% of Americans are classified as being quote unquote in poverty.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, if you want to know the single largest determinant of poverty, it's being a single mom.
Mm-hmm.
That classification by far away just is the highest poverty rates, right?
Right.
And of course, we can also reach out to our human side and say, boy, if there's anybody deserving of help, it's the single mom with a couple of kids. The kids and the mom deserve all the help they can get. But let's put that to one side.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we talk about those numbers, those income numbers that they use, we try to gauge the changes in poverty over time by looking at some income number, call it $22,000 a year. And then what we want to do is we want to look at someone earning $22,000 a year compared to somebody earning what we would call the equivalent of $22,000 a year, say back in 1985. Now, to do that, we have to inflation adjust.
Of course.
Now, inflation adjusting is at its surface very simple, but it turns out underneath it's far more complex than anybody truly appreciates. For example, the simplest idea of what inflation is, let's say there's two things. There's, a car, gasoline, bread, and I don't know, your rent, okay? So economists say, what did that cost you last year? What does it cost you this year? You look at the change in that cost, that's your inflation rate. However, you have to account for differences in quality. A car today is massively better than a car 10 years ago, which was massively better than the car 20 years ago.
True.
You can't look at the cost of a car and say you're getting the equivalent car service. So economists have to basically adjust for changes in the quality, changes in technology. And there's a lot of very bright economists in the BLS who do as good of a job as you can. But doing as good of a job as you can is not doing a perfect job.
No.
And in fact, while I know the conspiracy theorists all like to tell us that inflation is much higher than the government's telling us, it's actually the opposite. Inflation is much lower because there are massive changes in the technology in the world around us that make our lives better off than that never get counted in the data. And one of my favorite examples of this is this smartphone that 85% of Americans have a smartphone today.
Yep.
This is 12 years old. We still live the Great Recession, yet we always assume we had a smartphone in our pocket, which is nonsense. Now, why do I bring up the smartphone? Well, let's go back to that single mom. In 1990, if that single mom needed to get basic supplies for her kids, what would she do? She'd have to find someone to watch her kids while she went to the shop, or God forbid, she'd have to take the kids with her. And then how would she get there? She doesn't have a car, so she'd have to get on a bus. Maybe the weather's bad outside. You're in a rainstorm with two little kids trying to get to the damn store to buy diapers. That's a nightmare scenario.
Yep.
What does she do today? She pulls out her smartphone, she goes to Amazon, she buys the diapers at a very reasonable price. Tomorrow they're at her doorstep. So while there's no doubt from a relative perspective, there are some people being left behind, there is also no doubt that someone who is in quote unquote living in poverty today is doing significantly better than somebody who was living in that same level of quote unquote poverty 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Doesn't mean you don't want to help that family. Doesn't mean you don't want to help those kids. But let's take a step back before we're constantly wagging a finger at society and telling us how bad we are to people, and instead recognize the enormous gains that have been made. And the fact is life is a heck of a lot easier to live for anybody today, even those people who we call being in quote unquote poverty.
Yeah, and again, this is not saying that we should ignore those people by any stroke of the imagination, but it's shifting context and perspective, which I think is important. But again, the recent research showed that 80% of Americans say that they're living paycheck to paycheck.
And see, that's the kind of stuff. So I've seen these polls.
So that's why I want to ask you about this stuff, right?
They're just false. It's just not true. You look at the actual data, and we have great data from the Federal Reserve. Every 3 years, they do a wonderful survey on looking at people's wealth and their savings and everything else. And that number doesn't hold any sort of water. If you actually take a look at the numbers and what people have, there's no doubt. Look, again, thinking about it from a wealth perspective, how much money do you have? Are you truly living from paycheck to paycheck? You start digging into the data and you realize that there's about 20% of Americans who really have nothing. I mean, they have no money in the bank. They really do live hand to mouth, right? Absolutely, they do. That's 20%, not 80%.
Right.
So the official statistics just don't bear out those kind of horror stories. And you ask, well, where does that come from? Well, these surveys are built in a lot of ways, and I'm trying to avoid sounding accusatory. But very often these surveys are written in ways that guide people to give the answer that the researcher is looking to get.
Of course.
Everybody who studies surveys understands that surveys can be altered to push a particular objective.
Sure.
And that's exactly what happens in this kind of case. So you have somebody out there who, for whatever reason, has it in their head that their mission is to go out and prove to people how bad the world is. And they write a survey that verifies their particular position. Well, it's still wrong. It's just
Right.
wrong.
Well,
And
I
even
think
there,
there's
when you look at what people do, what people spend money on and stuff like that, the people who are truly living hand to mouth is it part circumstance of the economy around them, or is it in part some personal choices? That's a very uncomfortable statement to make. Obviously, some of these people have ended up in circumstances that they have no control over. But in a lot of other cases, there are personal decisions people are making. Personal responsibility is still an important concept in our society.
Well, I think it's a highly important concept and necessary for us all to have. But along with that personal responsibility is a high level of compassion so that we don't become a bunch of cutthroat lunatics.
Well,
right?
You don't throw people into the trash
Right.
because they made bad decisions. But what
Right.
you try to do is help them stop making bad decisions.
Right.
Yeah.
So, one of the things that's baffling, I live in a city called Vancouver. For anybody who's ever been here, it's an incredibly beautiful city. There's a lot of wealth here. We got a lot of influx of money from China that changed our housing.
Probably one of the nicest cities in the world. Couldn't agree more.
It's stunning. But I live in a city, actually in the area of the city, that has the highest discrepancy of income, because 3 blocks that way is all the homelessness.
Yeah.
And where I live in Cole Harbour is some of the most expensive property in Canada, if not some parts of the world, right? We're in the top 5 in the world of expensive. Yeah. And we can't deny that. And I also can't deny that it seems pretty clear just with my own observation that there seems to be a lot more homelessness. And I go to San Francisco, and as a speaker, you probably see the same thing. The people living on the streets because of the influx of, this tearing separation of what seems to be a 2-economy world, and the middle is disappearing. So the question I wanted to bring up around this is, there's a lot of talk about that America's middle class is vanishing. Do you believe that, or do you have stats against that? Tell me about that.
I don't. That's again. These are the kind of throwaway statements that make me just
Sure.
crazy. The middle class has shrunk, but a good portion of the shrinking middle class, by the way, has gone up, not down.
Mm-hmm.
Go back to the next step. The idea that even if you're relatively poor, you still have access to some of the most amazing technologies that people 10, 20 years ago would not have access to.
Sure.
Which again suggests that even if you're at that bottom end, you still have pretty good things available to you. Now, probably, particularly here in California, one of the most, you said it, homelessness. It's an enormous issue. It's talked about constantly. And it is tragic. I see it all the time here in Los Angeles. You drive down streets and you'll see little tent cities.
Yeah.
But let's keep context. The last census here in LA County suggested that the number of homeless in the county was about 50,000, maybe a little less. And you say, wow, that's a lot. Except for the fact that there's 10.5 million people living in this county.
Mm-hmm.
This is the most populated county in the entire United States.
Mm-hmm.
50,000 out of 10.5 million is actually a relatively small number,
Right.
0.5%.
Yes.
There's no doubt homelessness is tragic. But then the tragedy of homelessness actually is driven by other tragedies. Again, one of the things that people don't appreciate here in Los Angeles, these folks have always been around us.
Mm-hmm.
But because of the housing crunch, because of our unwillingness or inability to build enough housing here in LA, the folks who would formerly have been lived in a flop house somewhere, paying some minimal amount of rent for some squalid little place, well, that place has been basically taken over, upgraded, and is being rented out at more market rates.
Right.
These people have mental health problems. These people have drug problems. And we didn't used to have to see it, now we do. Yeah, Well, guess what, Californians? You deserve to see this. They were there, and they were there because we are the ones who cut back on those incredibly important programs to deal with mental health and to help folks with addiction. We're not living up to our responsibilities to folks who have these kind of problems. It's not a housing problem. It's a mental health problem.
Right.
And again, that is an issue we need to focus on, but we need to focus on it in the right way. People who think that rent control is going to help homelessness, they're not thinking straight.
No, I see that in this city too.
Yeah. You have to get to the root of the problem.
But again, so this, you and I talked about when we had a chat a while back, and we talked about, cronyism versus capitalism a little bit. And this, you brought up the subject here, like we've stopped investing in mental health programs. You say it's not a homeless problem, it's a mental health problem. I'd say, no, it's not that. It's a lack of mental care problem because, we used to have places where people could be taken care of and they went, here's your prescription, off you go. Oh, well, I can't work and I've got nowhere to live. Well, good luck with that. That is where I'm seeing this pull towards socialism in the United States because we're not caring for people and people are getting just thrown by the wayside.
Well, we do care for people. Again, that's a strong statement, right?
Sure. But as you said, people are out in the street because of mental health.
Let's talk a little bit about, again, some broken statistics.
Sure.
So Bernie Sanders and Warren and Liz Warren and some of the folks on the more radical left who are running for president will constantly go on about income inequality in the United States.
Yes.
And their solution for income inequality is a whole raft of new social programs to help those at the bottom. Okay. But the problem is this. When they measure income inequality, they're actually measuring it using gross income statistics. They aren't looking at measures of income inequality, which actually include various benefits you may receive. Healthcare from your employer, healthcare from the government, food stamps, housing supports, earned income tax credits. Now, there is another source of data. The Congressional Budget Office takes them a couple of years to process the data, but on an annual basis, they actually create a new measure of income inequality in the United States where they take into account taxes paid and various sorts of what you would call non-cash benefits received.
Okay.
Guess what? You look at that data, and it turns out inequality has barely budged from the early 1990s. Income inequality.
Yes, I understand.
Health inequality is exploding, completely separate concept. But income inequality hasn't changed all that much. And again, this is where I start to get frustrated.
Sure.
It's not to say we have too little income inequality, too much income inequality. The point here is you want to continue to expand social programs, yet you're not willing to take these social programs into account when you're measuring the inequality. That's a game you could never win. That's a recipe for constantly expanding social programs because your numbers will never look better because you're not accounting for the things we already do. So let's take a step back. Let's look at the real data and then have a debate based on actual facts. The actual fact is income inequality is not a big deal in the United States. The biggest issue in the United States is wealth inequality.